Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. Before we get into all the topics today, I think we're going to change it up a bit and go straight into beer talk. So, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead? Tell us what you got.
Because we've got a lot to cover today and could use a beer when we're talking about all this stuff. So what I have today, I have a beer from a local Lafayette brewery, Westbound and Down, which actually was the Great American Beer Festival's, I think, mid-sized brewery of the year, something like that, a couple years ago. Anyway, really good brewery, a good addition to Lafayette beer scene. This beer is it's a Mexican-style dark lager, which actually goes really well with the chili we're having tonight. But it's also a really good kind of winter lager. It's got the crisp hops of like a lager hops, right? Not overpowering, not overly bitter, just very kind of fresh. But a little bit of extra malts, a little chocolatey, a little hints of coffee kind of stuff going on in the background from the dark color. So it's a really nice winter lager, and the name Colorado Nights is perfect because it gets kind of chilly here. Good beer for it.
All right, sounds delicious. So today we're going to talk about Volume 1 of the Special Counsel report, and we've had a week of confirmation hearings so far, so we're going to dive into sort of the pattern that we're observing with the confirmation hearings. But before we talk about anything else, so I just want to do a quick little rant about what's been happening with the California fires and how Mike Johnson and Donald Trump have threatened to withhold aid unless, California changes their policies or whatever.
Not just them.
Right. And look, I understand it's fun to dunk on California. We do screw things up from time to time. But, this disaster is more expensive than Katrina. There are more Trump voters in LA County than there are Trump voters in the entire state of Mississippi. And, you don't want to go down this road where you start dangling all these disaster relief bills and say, well, you can't have it until you do X, Y, and Z. Because if the Democrats go down that road when they're in power again, Florida has hurricanes, Louisiana has hurricanes. So it's just such a stupid thing to threaten. You know what? Fuck off and just help us rebuild, just like we've helped you rebuild before.
It's not going to be our only rant of the day. I have something I want to say about the Department of Education. We're going to save that till the end because we have a lot of ground to cover before then. We are going to talk about, as you said, the special counsel report and the confirmation hearings. I wanted to touch briefly before we do that on the ceasefire in Gaza between the Israelis and the Palestinians and Hamas, because I think that's important to note. This war has dragged on a long time, right? And the ceasefire is a big deal, right? Especially for people living in that area, but also for people who are concerned about it throughout the world. And we have a lot of people in the United States who are, let's charitably say, they're just very concerned about what's going on over there. We've gone over that before. So briefly, what happened is they're going to release the remaining hostages in a couple phases. In phase 1, they're going to release 33 of them. This is Hamas. At the same time, Israel is going to release about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. And if you're thinking that math doesn't quite add up, you're right. But that's always how it happens in these trade-offs, because the Palestinians have come to realize that the Israelis really value their prisoners or their hostages and their citizens and will trade a lot for them. And the Palestinians have leaned into that. Yahya Sinwar, in fact, was released in one of these swaps years ago. I'm guessing the Israelis probably regret that now, but doesn't seem to have changed the way they're going about things. So this is a 42-day ceasefire. The Israelis are going to pull out from populated areas. Palestinian civilians will be able to return, right? There will be followed up, hopefully, and supposedly, by phase 2, which will have the remaining hostages and final prisoners exchanged with a permanent end to the war. And then in phase 3, again, hopefully and intended, but kind of speculative at this point, they'll rebuild Gaza. And I'm sure we're going to have to get back to discussing this at some point because they don't really have a plan yet. And to come up with a plan that's going to work is really going to be a challenge.
Yeah, I'll be surprised if they make it through phase 2, to be honest.
It will be, let's be optimistic, but cautious, I think. Probably the best way to approach that. Now, it does raise a couple questions. Main one for me is, well, why now, right? And from the Israeli perspective, you're in a little better strategic position, right? Things have changed in Lebanon quite a bit. Syria, things have changed a lot. Iran is sort of down. So you probably feel a little more confident, able to have a peace deal in Gaza. And to be fair, this happened because Trump got involved and wanted it to happen. This is more or less the same deal that's been on the table for months, right? Trump wanted a deal. Trump's Middle East envoy got involved, right? And Netanyahu is more comfortable working with Trump. I mean, I think that's been the case. That will be the case going forward, right? He's going to give Trump a deal that he wouldn't give Biden. Okay. Now there is a potential problem, and that's Israeli politics. And the far right in Israel is opposed to this, which is not really shocking, right? They say that it'll end the war too soon and Hamas won't be destroyed. Well, unfortunately, they're right about that, but they're right in a way that doesn't really speak against a ceasefire. We talked about this before, which was our lowest viewed podcast, so I'm guessing a lot of you didn't tune in. But when we talked about it before, we pointed out that, you know what? You're not going to destroy Hamas. So, of course, the far right is correct that the war will end before Hamas is completely destroyed. But unless you're going to have a perpetual, eternal war, it's going to have to end before Hamas will be completely destroyed. You're not going to kill Hamas to the last man, right? So that was never going to happen. The war hasn't really moved anywhere for a while. Israel's strategic goals haven't really advanced by continuing the war at this point in time. So having a ceasefire works for them in that case. It certainly works for the Gaza civilians. Let's hope it doesn't empower Hamas to come back, and hopefully they can figure out a phase 2 and phase 3 to kind of head this off. Again, I think neither one of us are particularly confident about that, but at least there's the opportunity for that. And if nothing else, if civilian casualties decline and stop, that's a good thing.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, the war definitely needs to end at some point, but I do fear that we're just kicking the can down the road. We're not.
Oh yeah, clearly
resolving the underlying conflicts, and frankly, no president has, right, since the founding of Israel. It's gotten slightly better over the years, right? Lebanon has made peace with Israel, Jordan has made peace with Israel and recognizes Israel, Egypt the same, right? And then we've also made progress in other Middle Eastern countries. Hopefully, the Palestinian Authority can get their foot into Gaza and start having a less radical version of governing, right? Hamas is, in my opinion, orders of magnitude worse than the Palestinian Authority. And while the Palestinian Authority does dabble in terrorism, they are just nothing like Hamas. So I would see that as an improvement if the people of Gaza are willing to accept the Palestinian Authority.
I would imagine a lot of the civilians are willing to accept anybody that's not actively getting them blown up at this point. So let's hope for the best. But you're right about sort of the kicking the can down the road. But again, that was the critique we had when we talked about this before. Israel didn't really have a strategy other than let's blow them up. And when that's all your strategy, you don't really have a time where you said, hey, we've won, because there's still some there. There will always still be some there. So you're either going to have to say, enough is enough, or keep at it indefinitely. And that's not really tenable, and it's not really getting them anywhere. So this seems like the best of a worst. I'm not going to say it's a worst outcome. It's a good outcome to stop the killing. But like you said, it didn't fundamentally solve anything yet. Hopefully, it's going to give an opportunity for that to happen, but we're not there yet.
Right. And I think because Trump will be president, it's a pretty powerful signal to Hamas that, hey, if you violate the ceasefire in any sort of way, Israel's going to have carte blanche to go in again and wreak havoc, right? So, there is that element of fear. I don't know if that's going to work because, Hamas hasn't really acted rationally.
I don't know that I go that far. I think you could safely say they don't care about the civilian casualties.
Right, that's what I was getting at, right?
Casualties are useful for them.
Yeah.
Because then they can show, look how horrible Israel is. So if they change their tune about that and decide, we've had enough civilian casualties on our side, let's retrench, then this could go forward. If they decide, you know what, this is good for us when Israelis kill Palestinians, which they have for the entire duration of this war until now, then we're likely to have a real problem before we get to phase 2.
Okay, so for our first segment of the day, we're going to discuss the Special Counsel's report, strictly Volume 1, because Volume 2 does not exist for us, the public.
Well, it exists, but Judge Cannon has, in her great benevolence, decided that we're not up for reading it. And actually, that is probably not an unfair thing to do because the trial's still going on for a couple defendants.
Right.
So to release a report about it seems premature on one hand. On the other hand, it is not going to see the light of day once Trump comes into power. So it's kind of like, let us release this now or it's going away, and it's going away. I don't think we'll ever see it unless someone leaks it. So
yeah.
I hope.
And Trump is probably just going to pardon them anyway. So if I was the DOJ, I would just drop the charges.
Yeah, I would drop the charges and release the report.
Yeah. So, it's a bit strange to cover this, right? In my opinion, it is really important to cover this, but the politics and the electoral impact of it, I think it's been proven that it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is the American public, they knew what happened on January 6th. They knew what Trump did, and they decided that, you know what, I'm either going to roll the dice on Trump, or it's just a factor compared to many other factors such as inflation, jobs, the economy. And the American people as a whole basically said, you know what, this is not disqualifying.
Well, I mean, there's even evidence that for a certain subset of people, the charges filed against him actually improved his appeal, right? They bought into the Trump as a victim narrative, right? So not only didn't they help disqualify him, they kind of boosted him in some ridiculously perverse ways. It's like, yeah, see, they're after me. Well, yeah, they're after you, but you're a crook, right? It's basically what this reports. I mean, and I think it's useful for us to kind of cut to the chase. For me, I think the important thing out of this, and we're going to talk about some of the details that people ought to pay attention to, but the important headline is that Jack Smith said, if we took this to jury, I believe he would have been convicted on these charges, right? He did these things. We have enough evidence. We could have got convictions from the jury. The only reason we're not pressing forward is he was elected president, right? He got his get out of jail free card, but he's guilty. And this is kind of unheard of in American justice, because the Attorney General, the Justice Department doesn't do that, right? They don't release reports saying, hey, we're letting this person off the hook even though they're guilty, right? That's not a thing, right? If they think someone's guilty, they're going to trial, right? The only thing I can think of that's kind of similar but different is Comey coming out and saying, right, we're not going to file charges here, but we don't think that Hillary Clinton performed properly when she had her private server, right? Which, again, very politically motivated, didn't help Hillary Clinton much, but it was so unusual that people took notice of it. And this is sort of unusual in the other way. We would have found him, we would have gotten a conviction, but he got off the hook because he's president.
Right. So the way I want to structure this segment is we're going to very briefly talk about what happened, fill in a little bit of details here and there. We're going to talk about the litigation issues that the special counsel and the DOJ ran into. And then we're going to talk about, what the law actually says, right? Because we called it an insurrection, but he wasn't necessarily charged with insurrection. So we're going to dive into a little bit on why that is. And then lastly, we're going to talk about, well, why did we as a whole fail to hold Trump accountable? So very briefly, as I said, we all know what happened on January 6th. We saw what happened at the Capitol, but what the report really dives into is sort of the lead up to that, right?
I mean, the main focus of the report, right, is the election interference, and not so much, as you're saying, not so much the storm the Capitol, which he didn't actually say, let's just paraphrase, right? Not so much the march on the Capitol and the urging of people to fight for their country, right? But the actual, hey, these are steps that he actually took to try to overthrow the election, right? And that's where Smith focused, and there seems to have come up with a lot of convincing evidence.
Right. So the first bucket, so to speak, is how Trump attempted to coerce state officials in the swing states. So we're probably familiar with the infamous call with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where Trump effectively said, I need X amount of votes. And there's been a lot of fraud. And boy, if you don't investigate it, there's going to be a lot of liability for you. I think most reasonable people would say, yeah, that's Trump really trying to get the Secretary of State to give the election to him. There are going to be a lot of partisans who, say, oh, he didn't really mean that. He's just speaking figuratively. But I think if you're in the position that Raffensperger was in, and the president of the United States makes a call to you specifically, and then starts saying, boy, there's going to be a lot of liability if you don't investigate this further. I mean, I would be legitimately scared, right? I mean, it's the most powerful man in the world effectively threatening you. And I do think it took a lot of courage for him to basically stick to the facts and say, no, this is what happened and nothing's going to change that, right? So I think, give credit where credit is due there.
I think you're right. Again, the issue isn't that people don't know what happened here. It's that people are choosing to interpret it through a political lens and pretend that the or come up with a narrative that fits the points they want to make, right? And we'll see that from our potential attorney general when we talk about the hearings. But, this is what Jack Smith is wanting to remind us of, that this is actually what happened. You can pretend other things happened, but they didn't. Here it is.
Yeah, and another state that he interfered with was Arizona. And this one didn't get much coverage, but he basically called the Arizona speaker and said, hey, I need you to have a special session, and we're going to replace the electors. Right?
Yeah,
so it's just
more
more
do
pressure.
that in Michigan and Wisconsin as well? At least in Michigan, they did, because there's people on trial in Michigan.
Right. So with Michigan, so this goes into the second bucket, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they had an alternate slate of electors in all 7 of the swing states. So, the original reason for the alternate electors was in case Trump was successful in litigation. And I don't think that's unreasonable. Having the alternate slate of electors is sort of standard operating procedure when you're in the litigation process. Now, yeah.
Has that happened before? I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, so Bush versus Gore, they had the same thing, right?
Did they? Okay, yeah. That's not my area of expertise in American
politics. So every state, you have the GOP electors and the Democratic electors. Right. You need to have them ready, because once the election is certified, you got to do the whole electoral process.
When they're certified, then they're done.
Right.
Did they?
Yeah. Right. So this is pre-certification, because the litigation was ongoing. Now, you're right that post-litigation, having an alternate slate of electors is a big no-no, right? Yes. You lost. You're done. And this is where you had the co-conspirators. They intentionally deceived the alternate electors. And they basically said, hey, you know what? You guys are here only for legitimate purposes. Don't worry. Now, some of the electors saw through the scheme and were like, yeah, no, I'm resigning, right? A lot of them were ignorant. And then there were some who were just on board no matter what. They're like, yeah, you know what? This is a wild idea, but I'm with you. On January 6th, we're going to get rid of the real electors, and then we're going to install Trump as president. And these alternate electors were supposed to be read by Mike Pence on January 6th. The next bucket of corruption was when Trump tried to coerce DOJ officials and Mike Pence to violate their oaths of office. So Trump wanted the DOJ to just say that the election was corrupt and that Congress would take care of the rest. So basically start pushing this narrative so that the people would effectively rise up in support of the true president, Donald Trump. Trump tried to replace the acting attorney general with Jeff Clark, who is co-conspirator number 4, and he would have just done everything that Trump wanted. And, thankfully, a lot of the Justice Department said, if that happens, we're all going to resign and you're going to have a huge mess on your hands. So, Trump backed off there. And then the last bucket, as we all know, he directed the mob to effectively storm the Capitol and to delay certification.
One thing I want to add, and it's weird to do this, but I think we should always do it, is just remind everybody how instrumental Mike Pence was in stopping this, right? If J.D. Vance had been vice president at the time, I'm fairly confident he would have gone along with Trump's scheme and tried to usher in the alternate slate of electors. I don't see him having the nerve or even interest or intention to stand up to Trump in the way that Mike Pence did. So I think we shouldn't underestimate how important Mike Pence was in just simply doing his duty, right? He didn't have to go out of his way to do anything weird. He just had to do what he was supposed to do. And he did, under a lot of pressure. People were calling for him to be hanged right there outside of the Capitol. If they'd have gotten hold of him, I'm pretty confident somebody would have done him some harm. When we think about, this could never happen again, or wasn't really in danger of happening, we would have been in a true constitutional crisis with a weaker vice president. And a lot of times there are weaker vice presidents. Right now, we're going to have a weaker vice president who would more or less do anything Trump asked him to do. So if there's constitutional crises coming up next time, I'm not overly confident that things would go smoothly.
Right. So we have all the facts about what happened, but how did we obtain those facts? So there were a lot of interviews done by the Justice Department before the special counsel was even appointed. So there are a handful of, I guess, constitutional, I don't want to call them defenses, but excuses for not testifying. The first one was that Mike Pence invoked the speech and debate clause because he was president of the Senate for January 6th. It's a reasonable defense, right, in order to not testify in front of the grand jury, but the courts rejected most of that argument. We also had issues with executive privilege claims. So Donald Trump invoked the presidential communications privilege, and that required a lot of litigation because he blocked senior White House staff as well as executive branch officials from testifying. This was resolved in the courts in late 2022 and early 2023, but you can see how when you put these roadblocks up, they're going to hinder an investigation, right? And when we get to the end of the segment, we're going to talk about why that's important, right? Because the whole point of this strategy was to delay, and take advantage of how the courts work. And then the last bucket was presidential immunity, and that took a long time to litigate, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Jack Smith had to issue a superseding indictment, but that added months to the process.
And again, we can spend a lot of time discussing how horrible the decision that is. Hopefully we won't have reason to get back to it based on Trump's presidency, but it wouldn't surprise me if we do.
Yeah, so those were sort of the constitutional arguments. There were two other buckets. I remember reading about this earlier on, but I had forgotten it. And then when I saw it in the report, I was like, oh yeah, that happened. So Twitter, post Elon Musk, they fought a court order because they wanted to inform Trump that all of his private communications on Twitter were subject to a search warrant. And Twitter was fined a massive amount of $350,000 for not complying. But it was interesting because this was the first time in history that this happened, that with this type of warrant, a tech company basically said no. So that was a pretty big deal. And it shows the influence that Musk has on the litigation process.
Also, the shows some potential issues that we need to look for if the right wing is going to start just ignoring the court, which basically did there. It's like it's kind of like the old Andrew Jackson thing. Okay, that's your order, now enforce it. And it's one thing to get that from a president; it's ridiculous. But to get it from a private citizen and you get away with it that's troubling, right? He's positioning himself above the law, and as long as the punishments are that trivial to him, he's going to get away with it. So it's up to his conscience and restraint for how he behaves. And that's kind of troubling.
Right. And the last challenge that the special counsel faced was Trump had to be gagged because his social media presence causes the harassment of so many people, staff, judges, witnesses, you name it. So if you look at pages 120 through 124 in the document that's in our show notes, you'll see some pretty horrific things that Judge Chutkan had to suffer through, and her staff, and a lot of other witnesses. I don't know if it merited charging him with witness tampering, because it's one of those things where it's stochastic in a way, right? Trump could basically say, oh, this judge is so horrible. What a disgrace she is. And he's not doing anything wrong there per se. But a lot of his supporters are going to look at that and be like, yeah, that judge is horrible. And a handful of those supporters are going to make threats. And because of that, Trump had to be gagged. And that was really shocking to see, right? A former president of the United States had to be gagged because the things that he was saying was so outrageous that it caused his supporters to just lash out against a bunch of no-name people.
Were you really shocked?
Not with Trump per se, but it's just a shocking thing that a former president of the United States has to be gagged, right?
Okay.
That's crazy.
It's a shocking concept.
Yes.
The example, not so much.
Right. Now that we talked about sort of these challenges, right? I want to talk about the intent here about delay. The reason why we had a special counsel in the first place is because immediately after the midterms, Trump said, I'm running for president. And that puts DOJ in a pickle because it looks really awkward for the current president of the United States to be investigating his primary opponent. And you could make the argument, it's like, oh, well, he wasn't officially the nominee, right? And he wasn't. But it's still a bad look. And so they had to appoint a special counsel, which in some ways hurts Trump more because the special counsel has a lot more resources, but you still have to transfer the original DOJ investigation to the special counsel's office.
Well, I mean, obviously that's the Trump strategy is delay, 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 delay. Hopefully you'll be able to drag this out until you're back as president. You can dismiss it all. But it begs the question of, okay, why didn't you have a special counsel on January 21st, 2021, right? Why isn't that one of the first things you do? We're going to get to the bottom of what went on here. We're going to hold him accountable, right? When you talk about the delay, there's a lot of things beyond the control of the Justice Department and the special counsel. But there are a lot of things they could have done to speed things up. If Jack Smith comes into office January 21st, 2021, that's 2 years earlier than when they put him in, right?
Yep.
More or less. You could have got a lot of stuff done if you moved. And I think a lot of what they did is they deferred to Congress for a long time. And that really played right into the delay strategy. Right, when you let Congress decide, oh, Congress will do their thing, and then we'll take. It's like, why? Why couldn't you start right away? Right? They assumed, I guess, that he was going to be impeached and convicted, or then they assumed that the January 6th committee would have some sort of real impact, and then they assumed they'd have enough time to get through these things, and none of these assumptions proved accurate. And here we are, that he is off the hook for a crime that the special counsel believes he clearly committed and would clearly be convicted for.
So what were the laws that Trump actually broke? Ethically speaking, he attacked the peaceful transfer of power. He effectively led an insurrection, right? But those ethical sort of things don't necessarily match to legal aspects, right? And the whole point of the legal system is to charge someone with specific crimes. And, the first thing to take note of is that this Supreme Court decision where they outlined the presidential immunity, it didn't really change much from Trump because Trump didn't really do much within his capacity as the president of the United States. And so even though it was a horrible ruling, in my opinion, it really didn't change much other than it added time to charging him and, coming up with a superseding indictment, so on and so forth. So the first charge that he had was called conspiracy to defraud the United States. Now that usually involves money or property, but case law did support the Department of Justice's interpretation when it comes to interfering with lawful government functions via deceit. And so, you can look at the special counsel's report and they talk about, the 4 criteria that you need to be charged with that, but they felt fairly confident that they would get a conviction. The second charge was obstruction and conspiracy to obstruct. And then the last one was conspiracy against rights. And so what was the right in question? Our right to vote. He tried to violate that, right? Because Joe Biden won. I do want to talk a little bit about the first charge, though, because the real meat of the trial would have involved around the aspect of deceiving and using dishonest means, right? And so they really took a lot of time in the report to sort of detail, one, what Trump's defenses were in a court of law and what the facts of the case were. So most people on the right would say, oh, well, Trump truly believed this, so he didn't really commit a crime because he really believed that he had won. And he's just investigating voter fraud, all that.
Kind of like the guy investigating the Pizzagate case by showing up with an AK-47. He really believed it. What's the problem?
And so some of the facts that the special counsel's office outlined were, I'm going to read this. In Arizona, the conspirators started with the allegation that 36,000 non-citizens voted in the state. 5 days later, it was beyond credulity that a few 100,000 didn't vote. And then 3 weeks later, a bare minimum was 40 or 50,000. And then the reality is about 250,000. And days after that, it went back to 32,000. So he's just making up numbers, right? And so the fact that he's saying contradictory things sort of suggests that he's just making shit up. There's no basis in fact.
His entire life history kind of indicates that he's just making shit up, right? So I think it doesn't meet sort of the smell test to say Donald Trump believed that he didn't, right? He knew, and as you know, we've sort of come to learn if you're reading through the report, it didn't really matter, right, for some of his actions, whether he believed it or not. The conspiracy to defraud is still a conspiracy to defraud, even if you believe you're doing it for the right reasons.
Right. And another thing that they pointed out was he was talking about election fraud before the election even happened.
Yes.
So this was all part of the plan, right?
For years, not just months, or weeks, years, he'd been laying the groundwork for this is going to be the most corrupt election since the last corrupt election. Right?
Yeah.
Even before he won, he was in 2016. He was talking about how corrupt the election was going to be. So this was not a good faith response to a problematic election. It was a guy looking for an excuse to remain in power.
Yeah. And the last one, I think this is sort of the cherry on top. It was the private statements with his family members and staff that showed that he knew he lost. He said, "Can you believe I lost to this effing guy?" to a staffer.
Yep.
There you go. Right. There's no way that a jury would like look at this whole case and be like, yeah, Trump really thought he won. That's bullshit. So I think one thing to point out is, well, why does the special counsel outline possible defenses, right? And if you read the Rob Hur report, which investigated Joe Biden's mishandling of classified documents, he was not indicted, Joe Biden, because Rob Hur said he's going to portray himself as an elderly man with a poor memory, something to that effect, right? And the whole...
That was kind of piling on. He basically said, he more or less said he didn't really commit a crime. There was no intent to commit a crime. And if we charged him, he'd be very sympathetic. That was one of those weird ones that's not the kind of statements they usually put out, right? We usually say, we don't have enough to charge, so we're not going to. They don't then go on to rip a guy's character for political reasons.
But I think it's important because in order for the DOJ to indict you, they basically have to believe that they're going to win for sure.
They can get a conviction, yes.
Right. And if you look at the conviction rate of the DOJ, it's above 90%.
Yes.
It's really, really high.
They're pretty good at predicting success.
And if you look at the conviction rates in other states, California, Florida, North Dakota, whatever, I looked at the average. It's a little under 60%. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, you can indict anyone. What's the saying?
Grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. Yes, that's
right.
Really cliche.
But if you look at the DOJ, if you're indicted, you're probably going to prison. So this is why they outline the defenses, because they basically need to litigate the trial during the indictment phase.
Yes,
that's just DOJ policy.
They've made these calculations, and he wants to share them. This is why he thinks that Trump would have been convicted, because here's the defenses. Here's where they're not very good. He goes through all that stuff.
Yeah. So I think the last question that people might be curious about is, well, why wasn't he charged with insurrection? So the special counsel's report goes into this. And to be frank, there just isn't a lot of case law when it comes to insurrection. Mm-hmm. They actually looked at cases throughout the world because there's so few American cases. And even though the courts basically colloquially call it an insurrection, that doesn't necessarily meet the legal standard to prosecute it.
Yeah, there isn't like first degree insurrection on the book.
And, ultimately going back to sort of this DOJ policy of really high conviction rate, they viewed it as too risky. Mm. And so if they don't think that they can win with certainty, they're just not going to charge you. Yep. Now that doesn't mean you aren't guilty from like an ethical standpoint, right? We're just strictly talking from a legal standpoint. And then they also talk about
an evidentiary standpoint at that,
right?
They might very well believe that he's guilty of that, but from the evidentiary standpoint, they didn't think they could prove it, right? Now it does bring me to the last thing I think we should talk about before we move on here is, why are we caring so much about this report, right? He got off, he's not getting charged. That's kind of the end of it. Why do we care, right? And part of the reason why we care is that these kind of things aren't going away, right? The Republican Party in particular is still trying to fuss with elections, and that's being polite. I don't know, if you've been following what's going on in North Carolina with the Supreme Court judge there?
Yeah.
For those of you that haven't been following this, briefly, in North Carolina, a Democrat was reelected to a Supreme Court seat by something like 700 votes or something. And they had 3 recounts or something like this. It would go from 6-2 to 5-3. Republicans can't stand this. So what they want to do is disqualify some 70,000 votes because they've discovered what they think is a disqualifying error in the registration forms that these people filled out. Some of these people, years and years ago, many of them Republicans, right? So they want to basically throw out, I think, 60,000 votes because they think if they throw out these votes that more of them will be leaning Democrats and they'll get their person elected. So they want to disqualify votes that were cast in good faith by people who almost certainly are voting properly because some form didn't include the right thing whenever they registered years and years ago. Some of these people could have registered before this was even a requirement, right? And disturbingly enough, the current Supreme Court in North Carolina, the Republicans who have an interest in this are like, yes, don't certify the election because we might be able to do this. And this will almost certainly get to the Supreme Court of the United States. And let's hope that they don't buy into this bullshit scheme of being able to disqualify voters because they voted the wrong way for your party. And this is why these things are important. North Carolina sees Trump got away with it. They're going to try to get away with it too. I doubt they're going to be punished in the way Trump was, but we can hope. This to me is very concerning, and it's something I would definitely keep an eye on. And if and does get overturned or does go to the Supreme Court, I think we'll want to talk about this in more detail because this is the kind of thing why you need to prosecute anybody who does this, because you can't let people get the idea, hey, all we got to do is pretend and maybe we'll win.
Yeah. And this goes back to accountability, right? So when this happened, there should have been political accountability. The day after January 6th, Trump was dead. He was politically dead. The election was certified, that they all came back together. They certified it. They wanted to say, hey, you know what? We are going to have a peaceful transfer of power. Insurrection be damned. And even among conservatives, the reaction was, this was insane. There are so many conservative columnists who basically said, you should shoot the protesters, shoot them, right? And it's just really funny to see this evolution that happened. And
when you talk about accountability and January 6th, right, I was astounded and deeply disappointed that Nancy Pelosi didn't bring impeachment charges on the 7th, right? If I was in charge, I would have had impeachment charges on the 7th, organized an insurrection, prompted people to storm the Capitol, get this guy out of there on January 7th. And I think if she did that, I really think that Republicans would have had to, I don't think he'd have gotten off. If they voted on January 7th, we saw this is what happened, vote or don't. They could have crammed that through, gotten it to the Senate on the 7th, if not the 8th at the latest, and then see if Mitch McConnell says, you know what, we're good, because he wouldn't have had the excuse that he's no longer president. He would have still been president, and he could have still done damage. I think that would have taken care of things. Even after that, Mitch McConnell still could have taken care of things if he wanted to, but he didn't have the courage to, and here we are where we're at. But we have no political accountability.
Yes, I mean, the Senate basically came up with bullshit excuses of, well, he's no longer in office, therefore we can't try him. There's a variety of reasons why, in my opinion, that's inaccurate. But whatever, it's their argument. But yeah, they just lacked the courage because the Republicans wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They want the MAGA votes. They need them, right?
They thought Trump would go away, but they wanted these people to still vote for them.
Exactly.
And whoops, didn't happen.
And then, there was a lot of support for a sort of 9/11 style committee, right? Mm-hmm. But then it just, over time, that support went away. Kevin McCarthy really undermined, the concept of this. And so did Mitch McConnell. And so you had this, quote, partisan January 6th committee, which, it elevated Liz Cheney and Benny Thompson. It looked bipartisan to me. I thought they were very fair with all the evidence that they gathered and the narrative that they crafted. And yet, here we are, right? So he was not held accountable, politically speaking, legally accountable. I go back and forth between this, right? Because on one hand, people say, well, he got off and therefore he wasn't held legally accountable, right? But at the same time, if you look at it from the DOJ's point of view, this is pretty unprecedented, right? To indict a former president like that.
Yeah, but if you're Trump and the Republicans, why do you care? And he didn't pay a nickel for his legal representation. He got the saps and MAGA to pay for all of it, and all the donors or whatever. That's where a lot of his donations go to, paying for his legal bills. So it didn't cost him money, right? It certainly didn't cost him any standing among his people, and he wears this as a badge of honor, right?
Yeah.
This is the deep state trying to screw me. Here I am as the victim for you. He's more or less playing the Christ figure, right? He's up there on the cross of justice being crucified for the MAGA types, and they eat it up. So I honestly don't think he suffered any accountability at all for this. The DOJ might think this is unprecedented, and wow, look what all the good work we've done. And they've done some good work. We've discovered all this. It just doesn't matter. Yeah. It hasn't hurt him at all. And I think it's fair to say that it's strengthened him.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we are where we are now, and he ran out the clock, and therefore he took advantage of the court system. But I'm trying to think of a scenario where, suppose he did get convicted, right? Mm-hmm. And the DOJ worked extra fast to get him convicted. But then he got off on a technicality, right? And he won an appeal because the DOJ, did something wrong with the evidence, or they didn't dot their I's and cross their T's. What would have happened then? And you can imagine a world how that actually makes the legal system even worse, and it riles people up even more and saying, well, they did illegal things and they tried to put him in prison, and now we're finding out that the DOJ is corrupt, and they actually have evidence of that corruption, right? And
you
so
can always come up with a scenario where it's worse, right? Yeah. But imagine sort of the best case scenario. Sure. What would happen? What happens if Trump goes to trial and is convicted and is sent to prison in, say, 2022, right?
Completely unrealistic, but we'll put through this argument. Yeah.
Right. But I mean, if we're going to engage in that, because I think that's more likely than finding out that the Department of Justice screwed something up, right? That doesn't happen that often in trials, right? If he got out on appeal, it would have been the Supreme Court jumping in and saying, oh, well, we think the president, blah, 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 blah. That would be far more likely in my mind than the Justice Department having made a substantial enough error that they let him out. But I also think if he goes to prison, right, we don't have a smooth sailing in any case. But again, in large part because Mitch McConnell and the Republicans didn't screw him to the wall when they could have. Right. They could have been done with Donald Trump. Donald Trump could be a retired private person that we're not even thinking about, right? But because they didn't, it put the government in a bad spot no matter what.
Yeah.
Either you have to go really slow and make sure everything's perfect and he can round out the clock, or you barge ahead, get him convicted, put him in jail, and half the country thinks he's there because you're punishing him politically, right? So either of those cases, right, it's just a bad situation for the country to be in because Mitch McConnell and a few other Republican politicians didn't have the nerve to support their principles.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And then lastly, when it comes to accountability, it's the voters. I mean, Trump won the GOP primary without even debating.
We got what we deserve, right? You can't say we don't deserve it. He won not only the Electoral College, but the actual majority of voters. So again, I have to go back to Mencken, right? Nobody ever went broke underestimating the intelligence of the American public or lost political office thereby, right? And people don't like to say, oh, don't look down on the voting public. They have their reasons. Sure, they have their reasons. But if you to look past somebody trying to overthrow the government and put him back in office, I can't explain that away as, hey, that's a good faith kind of rational decision from a voter, right? That's just, I find that a colossally stupid decision. And I've not read or heard or seen anything that it can convince me otherwise, that you can sit there and in good faith say, for the average voter, for the billionaires that are going to make all kinds of money off of Trump's policies, sure, why the hell not? But if you're the average Trump voter, what are you getting out of this to justify the risk you're entering into? You get to feel good because Trump is trying to screw the libs and sending immigrants home? Okay, yay.
Yeah. So, I mean, you compare this with like the 1970s when Nixon resigned. When I was studying Nixon, I was like, why was it even that bad? So what? Right?
It used to be a country where if the president did something bad, people cared
Right.
in his own party. The big difference there is, and I was very young here, so I don't remember much other than seeing Nixon leave and hearing Watergate
Right.
on the news all the time. But the big difference is the Republicans told him to get the fuck out.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. That wasn't happening now. There was very little apparently Trump could do to make them say that, because he could send people to storm the Capitol and they'd be still like, we'll look past that.
Yeah. And I think January of this election, 2024, Biden had been campaigning on this for months and months and months. And it was really clear that it just wasn't breaking through to the public. And the reality is, as you said, this is who we are as a country. This is the presidency that we deserve, right? We had our chance to take this into consideration and say, absolutely not. We're not going down that road. But as I said earlier in the segment, accountability just wasn't a priority. Whether you chose the couch or you chose Trump, you made your choice. We as a country made this choice. So There we go. Okay, so for our next segment, we're going to talk about the confirmation hearings. For the past week, various appointees have been interviewed, for lack of a better term, by the Senate. And it's been really amusing to watch some of these confirmation hearings. So who are these for, right? They're for us. Back in the day, before the cameras came into Congress, these hearings were a bit more serious, but now they're just performative. So each senator, they're just trying to prove some point, whether they want to get a good soundbite for a campaign ad, or they want to get a gotcha question, or on the more positive side of things, they might bring up a certain preference and policy that just isn't getting as much coverage as it should from their point of view.
They'll remind everybody of their own pet policy interests, more or less. Right. And I think we saw a lot of that right in all of these. And the common theme I think that we saw this week was that it looks like everybody that went out is going to be more than likely to be confirmed. Right. And I think it's useful to talk about a couple of them in more detail, right? We can talk about Marco Rubio is on one end of the spectrum. He's like a traditional candidate. He's a former senator. The other senators usually give deference to former senators. He came on and said normal things in response to normal questions. He'll probably get, I think, what we were talking, some like 80, maybe even 90 votes.
Yeah, he'll get a lot of votes.
He's a normal guy. He's going to go through the process. If you took this out of the context and showed it to somebody, it could be the same as a hearing from 30 years ago. Right. It's like not going to stand out any difference.
Yeah,
and he went down the spectrum from there. Right?
Yeah,
there are other people that were less common, less normal, less sane, and the questions kind of devolved a bit, and we'll have different outcomes. Different outcomes along the spectrum of they're going to get confirmed, but with different amount of votes.
Yeah, as you said, Rubio, he had a normal confirmation hearing. He demonstrated a mastery of policy. And then as we go down the spectrum, a good example is Chris Wright. He's the nominee for Secretary of Energy. If you look at his resume, he has a lot of experience with nuclear energy, geothermal, oil and gas, natural gas, what have you, right? Your standard serious Secretary of Energy pick. The one, I think, gripe that Democrats might have with him is he's not a climate skeptic. He believes in climate change, but he is a skeptic in terms of extreme weather events being related to climate change, right? The way I see it, I think he gets around 70 votes, but he had a fairly normal confirmation hearing too. But when it comes to energy policy, Democrats, really prefer green energy, and Trump obviously does not. He is worried about batteries electrocuting you on a boat, and there might be a shark that might bite you,
and windmills causing cancer. That's a big concern.
Yeah,
we should,
of course,
over that.
So 70-ish votes is my prediction there. And then you move further along, you see Scott Bessent. He's the Secretary of Treasury nominee, and again, very serious person, right? But when it comes to monetary policy and fiscal policy, you definitely see some more divergence between the Republicans and Democrats, right? Republicans are tax cuts for everyone, but primarily the rich. And Democrats, they want to tax
tariffs,
Yeah,
tariffs.
tariffs are new. And, if you look at what Bernie Sanders was talking about, well, he was talking about raising the minimum wage. It's what you would expect from Bernie Sanders. And I think you would expect that the Democrats are just going to vote against this guy, right? Because at the end of the day, there's not much reconciliation there when it comes to policy. You either support tax cuts or you don't. You either support minimum wage increases or you don't. And I think Raphael Warnock came up with a really good line of questioning. He asked, can we raise taxes on millionaires? And Bessent was like, well, no, because those are the small businesses. And
Trickle
then,
down economics for the win.
Right. And
There's
then
another thing with we get the kind of government we deserve. That's been proven to be a complete fraud and sham ever since Ronald Reagan brought it out. George Bush the first pointed out to us that it was voodoo economics, and it completely is. It doesn't work. It never has. It never will, but it won't stop them from pretending that it does, and their voters believe it.
Yeah. And then Warnock said, well, what about the billionaires? Can we raise their taxes? And he said, no, they're the job creators. So there you go, right? Yep. Irreconcilable policy differences. And so you might get maybe 2 Democrats, someone like a Fetterman who wants to pretend that they're bipartisan, right? That's about it. And then at the far end of the spectrum is where you get people like Pam Bondi and Pete Hegseth. And I have to say, Pam Bondi really came prepared. She knows how to play the game.
Well, so how hard is it to pretend you've never heard of anything that's substantive?
Well, I mean, you'd be surprised. A lot of people who are not prepared step on landmines and it ends their career.
Oh, I suppose. Yes.
So
she was. I suppose we didn't give her credit. She was very good at being able to say, "I've never heard of this phone call with Donald Trump and the election officials in Georgia. Tell me more. I didn't know that Patel has an enemies list. How would I have heard of such things?" Like, just stop, please, just please.
That was just surprising. I'm not surprised, I should say.
No, it's galling, I think, is what we're saying.
Yeah, it was galling.
Right. But I mean, that's sort of the one aspect of the people that Democrats are likely to oppose. Somebody that's just kind of full of crap and not taking this seriously in a good faith sort of effort, pretending that they're not going to have the policies they have.
As I mentioned before, she came prepared and she said all the right things, right? She said, I would resign if asked to do something improper. Right. I'm an attorney. I have ethics, blah, 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 blah. Trump can't run again in 2028. In order to have an investigation, you have to have a factual basis to do so, right? These are all things that someone for this position should and would say, right? Okay. I'm just saying that she came prepared. But again, obviously the red flags, as you mentioned, she seems to have amnesia for some really important events that someone who is
live ought to know, right?
Right. She said that she would study birthright citizenship. So that was Alex Padilla's question. You can look at the Twitter thread that's linked in the show notes and see some of these questions.
I wonder how long it takes somebody to read a clause in the Constitution.
It's not just reading, it's studying.
That's true.
And then I like to call this diet election denialism, where you admit that Joe Biden is president, but you still continue to cast doubts on the integrity of the elections, right? And that's where she is. And, if I'm a Democrat, I would just say, absolutely not. Even if you're full sugar election denialism or zero sugar diet election denialism, it's disqualifying.
If you're the person that's defending the laws and enforcing the laws of the United States, you have to understand that, hey, we have laws. It's not just the ones you like. But it gets to my basic conclusion from all of this, is that these people are going to get in. It doesn't really matter so much if it's any one of these individuals. If you swap these out for anybody else that Trump would put in this position, they're going to behave the same way. Even Marco Rubio made his peace knowing, to have this job, I have to do exactly what Donald Trump wants, right? He knows that if he strikes out on his own, he's out, okay? And it might not even necessarily be Donald Trump. It's whoever is the MAGA person in charge of his thing out of the White House, whoever Trump puts in charge, whether it's Stephen Miller or somebody like him that is motivated enough to pay attention. There's going to be no daylight between any of these people and what Trump wants. If he wants an investigation, there's going to be an investigation. She might pretend, oh no, we'll have all these reasons. Nothing will be political. It will be if he wants it to be. And if it's not her, he'll find somebody else to do the same thing. Same thing with Pete Hegseth. If it's not him, they might find somebody who's nominally more qualified, but he'll do the exact same things that Trump will want them to do, that Pete Hegseth will do. It's just, unfortunately, I look at it for most of these people. Again, if we started to talk about Kennedy, I'd have some exceptions just because he especially pisses me off. But I think you're going to get the same behavior out of anyone he would put into, especially the key positions, right? The way he looks at the Department of Justice, he's not putting anyone in that position that's not going to be first and foremost loyal to him. Same thing with the Defense Department.
Yeah, I mean, I think this starts becoming a skill issue, right? In order to survive the Trump administration, because I agree that you're either going to have to resign or you'll be fired or you do what he wants, right? That's basically what it boils down to. And I think the real skill in some of these positions is to just stay out of his field of vision. And, I think it's going to be hard for someone like Rubio to do that because foreign policy is such a major part of the presidency. But someone like Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Interior, a lot of these other ones.
But do those really, I think the ones that matter most to life in the United States, daily life in the United States, like the Department of Justice,
Treasury,
Defense, Treasury, those people aren't going to be out of the public eye.
No, they're not.
And I think they've all made the decision because they know what comes with the job, that they're expected not to resign, not to do whatever, but to do whatever Trump wants for however long they stay in the job. And I think they know that they've signed on for that. And I think that's troubling because last time, and we've talked before, and I'm sure we will again, about people he had last time, there was some independence there. Jeff Sessions really pissed Donald Trump off a lot in Department of Justice because he didn't do exactly what Trump wanted. He had some sort of set of principles that he followed, right? Same thing in Department of Defense, same thing in Department of State. It's like he picked real serious people that were qualified more than loyal. This time, the other way.
Right.
Loyalty over qualifications, 100% across the board.
Yeah, so I think we can move on to Hegseth. And as someone who grew up Republican and really respects the national security apparatus, it's just so demoralizing to me to see someone like Hegseth get anywhere near this job, right? And to have so many allegedly serious Republicans just fucking fawn over him, it's insane to me, right? The Republicans are supposed to be the national security party. And I can understand the argument of like, oh, our standards have been lowered, this and that, even though I don't necessarily agree with it. I can at least understand that argument. But then how can you fucking say that, oh, well, this guy's clearly qualified? You're lowering the fucking standards for Secretary of Defense. Right?
I can't keep up with you. Just for our viewers, I told Justin that he planned to be swearing a lot in this segment. I was going to have a drink every time he dropped the F-bomb.
Yeah. So all right. You're almost done with your beer, so I'll try and lay off there. But okay. It's just incredibly frustrating to me.
Yeah, and it is a joke. I mean, I was been aware of politics longer than you, right? Being older than you. And I was Republican way back in the day because I was impressed by the national security approach. That's the part that made me more interested in being a Republican until I had a number of change of hearts for any number of reasons. But the idea that the Republican Party doesn't cares so little about the national defense that they'll appoint somebody radically unqualified to run it is definitely mind-blowing. I mean, you compare, Caspar Weinberger did a lot of nasty things, but he was somebody serious about national defense. Henry Kissinger was probably the most serious person about national, I mean, he wasn't the Secretary of Defense, but he was a serious person. Republicans used to take serious people and put them in serious positions. And now they're taking comically inept people and putting them in serious positions. And that's the point, right? They're a lot of what they're doing is just to troll us with what, they don't care what happens other than that Donald Trump gets exactly what he wants.
Yeah. I mean, part of me is thinking that these serious national security types, they're just looking at the situation and looking at Hegseth and say, this guy is so unqualified, he's just going to get steamrolled by the generals and the DOD is going to run itself.
Maybe.
That's the best case scenario, though, right?
He would be more than happy to put in Donald Trump's idea of the commission to review generals and fire the ones that are sufficiently disloyal, right? To create an officer corps that is entirely loyal to Trump. And that is really disturbing, right? If anyone who's not scared by a political rather than a professional American military does not understand the problems with military meddling in politics throughout the world, throughout history. We are amazingly fortunate to have a professional officer corps. And if we move away from that and have a political officer corps, that changes a lot of what happens in this country.
It changes the world, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because our ability to project power is world changing. I want to talk about the Democrats and their strategy here. And I have a lot of gripes with it. So I will say that Hirono asked some good questions, the senator from Hawaii. One of her questions was, would you comply with Donald Trump's order to shoot protesters in the leg? Because Secretary of Defense Mark Esper rejected that order. And the way Hegseth answered that question was just so unsatisfactory, because the correct answer is no. And if you would give that order, just lie, right? Just lie. Because if you did give that order, committing perjury is going to be the least of your concerns, right? So just lie. And the fact that he didn't lie, I think, just goes to this notion of you have to show loyalty to Trump. It's a signal, right? These hearings are for us. And you know who else is watching? Donald Trump.
Donald Trump. Yep. And so one thing I wanted to mention about Democratic strategy before we wrap up this bit, and we talked about this before, is that I think the Democrats are making a mistake about looking at this in a vacuum. They're looking at sort of confirmation hearings, where they ought to be looking at everything else that's coming down the pike soon, mainly speaking, the debt limit, right? That's a big thing that's coming down. And the Republicans have talked about steamrolling this through in reconciliation and not compromising with Democrats at all, right? I would have the discussion right now about that and figure out how to have a bipartisan compromise on this kind of stuff and offer, hey, this is our working plan where we'll work together on these things. We'll give you this. We'll talk about these things. We'll work together. And if the Republicans say, nope, we're doing it on our own, then Democrats should say, all right, scorched earth, we're going to oppose you on everything to the man. If you're not willing to compromise, we're not willing to compromise, right? If you give them this, right, when you have any kind of leverage and keep moving away and backing down and setting up the precedent that, sure, do whatever you want. Because the mandate, they won, and he won a majority, but it's still a very closely divided country. And for Democrats to just retreat and let the Republicans do whatever they want is really going to be kind of a problem for them, as well as, right, the country at large. And that tees me up for my little rant I'm ready to give, unless you want to comment more about that.
Yeah, I just want to talk about Senator Duckworth's questioning, right? In the show notes, go ahead and look at her questioning, and she makes Pete Hegseth look like an idiot. So she basically said something like, can you name any of the countries in ASEAN? Now, I had never heard of this, but I'm also not running for Secretary of Defense. And, he gave an answer of like, well, Japan and South Korea and Australia are allies. And Duckworth said, well, none of those countries are in ASEAN, and you should do your homework, something to that effect. And I think, you have to look at where Hegseth is vulnerable. It appeared based on these confirmation hearings that they thought Hegseth was going to be vulnerable on women in the military. And I think we could all agree that women in the military, especially the combat ones, they're just as good because they're meeting the same standards as the men, right? They are patriots. They're doing their duty. And I think leaving that...
I don't know that we all agree, because Pete Hegseth doesn't agree.
Sure. Reasonable people do. And I think having Tammy Duckworth, who is a combat veteran, who lost both of her legs when her helicopter got shot down, she'd have been the perfect person to just grill him on that. And then you don't need any of the other senators to do that grilling, right? You could have had Mark Kelly, who is an astronaut and was a Navy pilot, just grill him on, the successes and failures of the F-35 project. Just start throwing stuff that the Secretary of Defense should know.
Fortunately, though, do you really think that would have mattered?
I think it would have put more heat on Pete Hegseth, because after that hearing, it became clear that he was going to be confirmed, that he was going to have the votes.
Basically, I think that they're all probably going to be confirmed. I think we'll see some of the symbolic things like, if you're in a swing state and you got an election in 2 years, you get to vote no on this one, right? Because we still have 51 votes. That's what I think we're going to see on this. And
I think so too.
I agree with you that the Democrats could have had a better way to approach things. But as we know, they're not particularly good at sort of giving up an opportunity to jump into the spotlight to let somebody else do something that's effective.
Yeah, it just was very frustrating because I think that Hegseth knew that these questions about women in the military were coming, right?
Yep.
And he prepared and he answered them well, in my opinion. And it was just really frustrating that they didn't have a plan B, the Democrats.
Nope.
And they clearly had a strategy, right? But they didn't have a contingency plan.
No.
And I just think that they really missed an opportunity here to just grill him on just stuff that anyone running for this position should be familiar with.
Yep.
And Duckworth, in my opinion, was the only one who was successful. But all of them should have been doing that. But they didn't.
Well, I mean, that again, now I'm going to tee myself up again because I think you did a good job of giving me a segue here into this last little rant I want to have about sort of the last hurrah of the Department of Education, right? Because it doesn't seem to me that Democrats are ready to try to figure out what happened, why they lost, why they're where they're at. And I think you can see that in their approach to the confirmation hearings because it was kind of disjointed and they didn't really know what to do to really take advantage of the situation. And it's when you see in the Department of Education, this is kind of under the radar, but they came out, I think yesterday or the day before, and yesterday, saying that all the NIL money in college sports needs to follow the Title IX mandates of equal distribution between men's and women's sports. So more or less, all the money that college football players make, half of that has to go to women's golf and women's soccer and women's volleyball because it's not fair to give it to the men who earn the money because Title IX says so. And this to me is preposterous for a couple reasons. First and foremost, you put this out the Friday 3 days before Donald Trump is coming into power, and clearly the Trump Department of Education, for as long as it exists, is going to say, no, that's not our ruling. That's not fair at all. Beyond that, they're still looking at DEI like it's a thing, like we need an equity in outcomes, not equity in opportunities, but equity in outcomes. And finally, the big problem Democrats have is they can't win enough male votes, right? The gender gap is huge. And men are going to see this and they're going to be like, wait a minute, how is this fair? How is this going to make me think, you know what? I should have voted for Democrats. I just made a huge mistake. And this kind of thing in particular is where Democrats are vulnerable and just don't understand the political environment. Because I didn't read this on the Times or in the Wall Street Journal or anything like that. This was on ESPN. People who don't pay attention to the news pay attention to ESPN, right? The men that watch ESPN and are college football fans aren't going to think, well, yeah, my college shouldn't give money to the football players to keep and attract football players. We should give this money to the women's sports teams. Right? This is just not, there's zero way this is a popular opinion amongst the fans who pay attention to ESPN. And this is the kind of thing, this is a small incident, relatively speaking,
Sure.
But it's very emblematic of how the Democrats are just not aware or don't care, I guess, of a lot of the political realities in the country. They're more than willing to make a point rather than make something realistic.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. The Democrats need to get their message out somehow. And once they do, the message has to be where the voters are. You can train your voters over time, but at the end of the day, the next election's in 2 years.
Yep.
2 years is not enough time to change the zeitgeist of the country. So there's going to have to be a shift in both directions, right? You might want to be here and the voters are here. And over time, you might be able to get the voters here, but you're not going to be able to do that in 2 years. So you have to meet the voters where they are, or at least
the last election, the Democrats didn't do that.
Right.
So as we've been saying today, like Democrats should be able to pull the voters into you know what? This guy is too dangerous to be president. Didn't happen. You got to go where they are. You want them to vote for you. You have to go meet them where they are and figure out how you can have a policy that you're happy with, that they can live with too. And the Democrats are not on the right path.
Yeah. And in Harris's defense, she did do that, right? I think she saw the writing on the wall that, this democracy stuff, not working. I'm going to focus on the economy. It just wasn't believable, right?
It was too late.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was a very far-reaching conversation. I thought we covered a lot of interesting stuff. Hopefully you guys enjoyed what we talked about today. I'll say that this week to be sure to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. We'll see everybody next week.